All right, everybody, our final reader tonight, Andrew McFadyen-Ketchum. I'm not going to read from his bio at all because he's a writer, he's an editor, he's a ghostwriter, which is a really weird and awesome thing, and he may tell you some about that in a moment. But the way in which I know him best is as a teacher. He was getting ready to finish at Southern Illinois University when I started there, and so as one of the old people, in wisdom at least, part of his job was to come and observe the new people when we taught composition classes and make sure we weren't acting like idiots. And so I will never forget the response that he gave to me after watching me teach for the first time. And this is just a few weeks into my teaching career. And he told me afterward, he said, you know, you've got all the content down, but bring some of your personality into the class. So you have an interesting personality, use it to teach. So if you've ever had to deal with my bad humor, if you've ever had to hear too many of my stories about things that happened years ago that I try in some feeble way to connect to the subject matter, it is this man's fault. So take that out on him afterward by buying a book. I should say one last thing. He was an encouragement then. He's still an encouragement now through a very small but I think very wonderful thing that he's been doing lately, which is that he's got this series of photos that he posts of fun and beautiful things that he's doing while writers are yelling at each other on Twitter. And so I think it's phenomenal. I love you, man. And I love that encouragement, and I love that mindset. And so without further ado, Andrew can read.
Hey man, thanks for bringing that up. Because I wanted to thank you, for real. Don't go to Twitter and look into this. But like for real, there's like a lot of there's like a war going on between individuals who don't have a war to fight. It's insane, and honestly, it's a common event these days in the poetry world. Like we're constantly bickering with each other about one thing or another, and sometimes it's valid, but it's very frustrating. And I was gonna say that I really wish I think what you're doing here with this series, and how many writers do you bring in a year? It's a lot.
There's a lot this year.
I was like, dang, it's like 20.
I don't know that the budget will bear that out next year.
Yeah, well, you know. But he's bringing in a lot of writers here, and that's not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of work. And I honestly think we need to abolish AWP and have all these people at all these universities do more things like this, because I'm getting to know Amelia and Casey and I'm sorry, what's your name? Dennis. We need to hang out after because I've never known you before, and I'm excited to get to know you. Like we're getting to know each other. We're gonna hang out. It's gonna be good. If we have an argument about politics, we'll do it face to face rather than on social media where we can really misbehave. And so I just really appreciate that you're bringing people here together, and I'm excited to get to know all of you. Okay, so I'm going to read 4 poems, 3 of which are preordained, and 1 of which you get to pick. All right? Yeah, it's like interactive a little bit. So this book turned 5, a whole hand, on March 1 of this year. So another thing, I like to do a lot of different things on social media that aren't yelling at other poets. But one thing I'm doing is I'm reading a poem from it each day. So if you want to find me on Instagram, I am the Meandering Poet, because I meander a lot. And on Facebook, I'm just me, Andrew McFadyen-Ketchum. But every day I read one, and it's been a lot of fun. So this was rather apropos. I'm going to start with the word damn and the word God. And like I said, I'm going to read 3 preordained poems and then 1 that you get to choose. The first one is kind of longish. The second one is pretty short. The third one is pretty longish, and then of course you get to pick the 4th one. So for this first one, it's a few minutes long. If you wander off because it makes you think of something or you get bored, that's okay. You can come back. So just stick with me. This is the word damn and the word God. Who knows what strung those two words together on my tongue the summer Chris moved in across the alley. All those long June hours we tiptoed the rusted out railroad, begging for the vibration of approaching freight, or playing Yahtzee, camped out in the dome tent pitched in his backyard, searching in the numbers for any sign of first light. But my money's on the afternoon I stepped into a mining bee's hive, mid-stride catching a touchdown spiral with time running out, their home woven among the roots of Chris's peach tree. For weeks thereafter, St. Anne's Catholic Church across the street called, "Repent, repent." I, the kid who stormed the neighborhood in escape of bees, crying countless curses, every inch of my body scorched, a hymnal of God damns tucked between bicep and bird chest. Chris's father poured 2 gallons of gasoline on that construct of whispers, and my father let me watch him drop a lit match into the earth from our high kitchen window. That night, Chris gave me a mason jar of dead miners curled up like wolf spiders swept out from under the couch, and all night I dreamt of the mason's magic, bees rising on invisible spindles in the grass in that pause between time and conflagration. But my mother decided that it was Chris, who through the darkness of a few nights later she heard screaming God damns with each strike of the father's leather across the son's back. I cried when my father told me I no longer could play with Chris, and he wept when I said that Chris is the only friend I have. Chris, who caught a carp a day later, his prize strung up by an arm's-thick tree branch through its gills. Chris, who liked to strum the testicles of his pit bull Rex, who was mean as hell, kept chained to a sycamore by the alley between our yards, but when Chris was around, would turn into the sweetest of things. Chris, who I thought of this morning as fog lifted to reveal 3 acres of wheatgrass, frosted silver, reaching for the pole star like a bed of nails, and I was flung back to the day I stumbled from Chris's basement with a 2x4 rust nailed to my heel, Chris unhooking Rex's chain, the panic bitter in my mouth, my eyes squeezed shut, then the warm slap of Rex's tongue from foot to nail, from nail to foot. Chris and I bearing witness to the healing power of a dog's saliva as he rubbed Rex's balls, and Rex groaned as blood eased from my skin. He and his father moved late that fall, chasing factories deep south, and now Chris lives in that place where everything seems true. Some say his father took to Evan Williams. Some say Chris simply became what he already was. And I wish I could say I've run into him in line at the DMV or at some bar I've come to for the dancing, and there's Chris, stitched into fishnets, neon strobes like moons in his vinyl knee-highs, eyes shadow thick as clay and tire tread. Wish I could say we've laughed over beers and told old stories, slapped one another on the back, and argued over the tab. But Chris's father didn't bother to clean the boning nice sequined from yet another Sunday on Arkabutla Lake. 3 largemouth reserved on their bed of ice, Rex outside howling. And now I wonder if this explains that summer of goddams Chris yowled down all those dreary railroad miles, how he always knew at the splits which curves turned towards the switchyard and which paved the path to Tennessee's Jerusalem. So glory be to the goddams, he cried, all those hours it takes a knife to the gut to kill a man. Goddams to the hours it must have taken Chris to die. Goddams to the carp we never caught, to the knife destined for Chris's gut. Goddams to all dogs too weak to loose their chains. Goddams to all the stories we do not tell. To all fathers angry with their sons. Goddamn. If I could, I'd take Chris in my arms. I get down with the grit and linoleum and patch that rift of skin with my tongue. I'd hold the boy drunk between two lives. I'd freeze ourselves and wait for the sculptor who fools greatness out of stone. Our two bodies draped one into the other. The word damn and the word God. We had this really jovial, added feeling in the room, and I started reading. So a lot of you are students of writing here. Do you ever go to workshop and you turn in this poem and everybody says, I really like it, or I really hate it, but I really like it, but it's two poems. Does that ever happen to you? Just nod yes, because it will if it hasn't yet. It's really annoying. And I remember in graduate school, this is before Brooks got there, but that poem was actually part of another poem. There were two, and they're both in the book. I'm not going to read the other one because it's very controversial. I don't want to go there. But and they're about the same time period, the same characters. And I remember sitting at my then grandmother-in-law. Is that what you call your grandmother's not here today? Grandmother-in-law's dinner table. And she was sort of getting annoyed because I was in the way. She was trying to set the table, and she said, "You need to get out of here." And I was like, "I need to split up these poems." And it was this neat moment. So if that ever happens to you, that's a good thing. And you can still end up in your book, and your grandmother will be less, grandmother-in-law will be less annoyed with you. All right, this is singing. This is the first poem in the book. And one thing that's neat is it's actually the last poem I wrote for the book, and I wrote it very intentionally. My mentor at the time, Judy Jordan, who is this firebrand of a poet and human, and we were working on this. This is my thesis in graduate school. Actually, a lot of the time you write a thesis in graduate school, and then you just sort of burn it. And Amelia's nodding. You just sort of it never actually makes it. This actually made it, and we were working on it. She said, you got these longer poems and you've got some shorter ones, but you really need to prove you can write a short poem early. I thought, that's a good idea. And she said, you really need a poem that sort of says what the book is about. She said, you need a thesis poem. To which I, jumped out of my seat and got very offended. Thesis, poetry? No, of course not. And of course she was right. So I wrote this from that, and I think she had the right idea. This is called Singing. What do I know of God, but that each winter I thank God for it. No spider web snagged in the blue stem, no horseflies at rest and blossoming cones of henbit, no slug trails pinned to the cooled hoods of cars. We are creatures all, stillborn to the language of split pine rails standing in their picket, ice glazed to bone in every rut, the stealth tracks of jays, a sleepless ideography in the snow. But we are not entirely alone between the mountain ranges, and these hours condemned to darkness before the sun jars open the face of February and the red flare of Mars grows dim. Just outside my door, the bur oak is wintered, full of grackles, hundreds of coin-eyed scuttles ornamenting its branches. Here, my breath plumes gray, and the distance brush catches fire. The wind, if you watch, is calligraphy. The stars in winter are weightlessness. The grackles are doors, rasping their flight plans limb to limb. The grackles are doors, some limbed with light, others black. Rising, my arms have long been open. Stepping across these thresholds, I step across these thresholds. Singing, I sing. Okay, so, wrong way. All right, so this third poem that I've predestined, I'll have to use big words for things that mean I chose it before. This is the title poem, and it's actually the first poem I wrote for the book. And I don't know
Actually, I do know. You were struggling too. Like that first year of graduate school is rough for everybody, but I think it was pretty rough for us in particular. You know, it just was. I think we were like maybe catching up a little bit. At least I was. I think we were catching up.
You know, some people that come in, they're kind of ready, like they got stuff that's good. Like I didn't have anything. I don't really know where I got in. But anyway, and my first semester, I had Judy Jordan as my professor, and as I said, she's a firebrand of a poet, and particularly as a mentor. And the first poem I wrote in there was a poem about Jeffrey Dahmer, and it was in, which now would be very popular. And it was in iambic pentameter, which now would not be popular. And I'd never written another poem in iambic pentameter, but I was really trying to work really hard. And she had this practice where she would, you know, there were like 10 people in the workshop, and she would have all the poems stacked up. And the one on the bottom was either the best one or the worst one. Mine was on the bottom in my first workshop. I knew I was totally screwed. And so we went to this workshop, I finally got to mine, I read this thing, I knew it was bad, and they just ripped it apart. And they were like people trying to be nice, but it was like pretty obvious, like she just sort of sternly sat there, and they ripped it apart. She ripped it apart. She literally said, never write a poem like this again. She's rough, man, she's rough. And then she said, but you know, Andrew's a good poet. He's worked hard. He got here. He got into our program. This is an excellent impersonation of Judy. He got into our program. We must find something good about this poem. And she looks around. No one has anything to say because she spent the last 10 minutes telling us why it was like really mean and terrible. And she goes, nice font. You know, if we want to get in a Twitter war, that's something worth getting in a Twitter war about, you know. These days, I think she'd be a little softer, but she just, I don't know, she was doing her best, I guess. And it was Garamond, which is a nice font. But anyway, I wrote then 2 more, and they were bad, and then I got to this one. And so my dad is this really amazing storyteller. He's had an amazing life. He's still living an amazing life. He's got many more years to go. It's very exciting to see what he's going to do. But he did all sorts of crazy stuff as a young man. I've kind of followed in his footsteps a little bit. And if you're curious to learn more about him and his stories, I've actually started a YouTube channel and a Facebook page where you can find his stories. It's called There I Was. So if you go to Facebook and look for There I Was, there's a picture of an old man and a young guy, that's me, together. That's us. If you go to YouTube and look for There I Was, it's new, so you gotta kind of look around, you know how YouTube is, but and it's videos of him telling his stories, and then me reading the poems from this book that are versifications of those stories. There's 5 of them in here, and the Ghost Gear is the title poem. I'm going to read here in a second. And it's a really neat thing to see him do his thing. We've actually done some live shows together. It's pretty rad. I think you'll like it. But yeah, so what happened was in graduate school, this was the 4th poem I turned in, and I knew I had something, but I didn't know if it was going to be good. And here we came in a workshop. I'd been excoriated, really told I was a bad poet basically for 3 weeks at that point, which is a long time in graduate school. And here we're on the week 4. Where do you think my poem was in workshop?
On the bottom.
It was on the bottom. And I was like, oh no, I'm screwed again. And she got to it and she said, you should submit this to Poetry Magazine. Which is a big compliment, and I did. It got rejected every single time. This finally got published in Copper Nickel, but it really became the anchor of this notion of versifying my father's stories, which I've been trying to tell in one form or another my entire life. Versifying them really worked, and it's the backbone of this book. Okay, so this is the longest one, so stick with me. If you get a little lost, it's okay. This is Ghost Gear. Low tide, my father high steps the trammel net, stoops half submerged into Naga Bay, and begins the work of disentangling yet another sockeye from the interlaced snares. He stands before me now, the same foot shorter he's been the last 15 years. My sister and I, nothing back when he was young like that, but a notion. When he could still hold his breath, he likes to say, well over a minute.
How or why, I've learned not to ask. The familiar arc of his story cast out like he, the newest member of the crew, flung to the farthest edge of the inner tidal. I could also hear better then, he always adds, and good thing I always think. Otherwise, he'd not have heard that thin cry of alarm from the beach. Otherwise, he'd not have looked up from his work to see the bellowing chord of the continental shelf rise to obscure summer's first dusk, as if Britomardis herself, goddess, a fisherman, has half risen from the sea to encompass that final island of the Aleutians. Dumbstruck, my father watches the wave suck in the tide like a maw. His legs, wranglers rolled to the knee for the first time exposed. The net, an organism in and of itself, a bare root system. Salmon left clapping wet sand as far as the eye can see. A wave the width of his vision, charging the land. My father claims that in such moments the body lightens. My father claims that there he saw himself, bird's eye view, that he watched himself look up at the sky, and the sky had become a mirror. And he sees his body ascend the cumulus as if pulled by threads of light, each thrust of the sky's wide wings lifting him ever closer to a rift in the clouds. But my father does not kneel genuflect to the gods. My father does not consider his sins or ask for forgiveness. Rather, he gives his marrow to those ropes. He weaves himself into those moorings. And the last thing he sees is the wave. And the last thing he hears is something like the clap of 1,000 hands, and the sea took him. Language fails my father here, so he resorts to sound. Wham! Slamming one open palm into the other, as if to quash something living. His posture surging in our living room, the tumblings of his cliffhanger, body whipped by the imagined sea. How do I describe what seemed like hours beneath the waves? I am a poet retelling a telling. The sea did not care about my father, but the wave came and went, and my father held his ground. The backdraft strong in the waves' wake, Britomardis' final tug for his spirit. And he lashed the flesh of his life from that ocean, and the water receded. Now, my father lights up when he tells how he returned to the beach as slowly as possible, and how, when the men finally saw him emerge from the sea, they cheered his name. My father returned from what they believed to be the dead. Ghost gear, they call it. Nets and riggings lost at sea to fish for no man. Blindly trolling seines illuminating the deep with their bioluminescent catch. Ruptured buoys and trammels coasting past coral reefs until they drift down, down, down into the dark. Only once have I asked my father, why did you choose out there to live? Only once has he told me that as the wave approached, he heard a voice. And that voice asked him, are you a father? And my father said, yes.
Okay, so that ends the predetermined, preordained section of our program. And this is going to be the last poem of the night, so let's make it a good one. So I'm going to narrow it down for you. Okay, so we've got, and thank you again for having me. And I don't know what the plan is after this, but I assume we're going to get a drink or something. If y'all want to come and you're old enough. Oh, if you're not old enough, don't come. And this book is it's $20. If you don't have any cash, guess what? That's not a good excuse. I have what's called a phone, and on it you can take money from people, right? You know, and I can take your money. Credit card, Venmo, PayPal, baby, I got it all. All right, I'm this freelancer. Oh yeah, ghostwriting. So I ghostwrite books, and I recently wrote a book on retirement, which is really boring. But right now I'm working on a book called "Bullied Behind Bars: A gay Christian Trump supporter goes to prison."
The irony in that?
A little bit of irony.
All of the irony
Yeah.
in that is gonna.
I'm on month 9 of working on this book, and I'm hoping to have it done at month 12.
Is it about a real person or is it all
It's
fiction?
about a real guy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Good question, though. And yeah, it's a pretty interesting life to have, to be a ghostwriter. It's also a really sad story. Okay. Now I'm going to read you a poem. Okay, so, all right, you got a poem about skinny dipping, driving an old car off a cliff. These are all true. Wait a minute. Yeah. Wait, what's that one about? What am I? Night driving. Joy. Oh, yeah, right. Okay, skinny dipping. I forgot about this one. Driving a car off a cliff because it was really old, and that's what you did. Watching Basic Instinct, and if you've never seen that film, you won't get why that's significant, but if you have, you will. Or joyriding in my mother's car. I took her keys off the piano. It's really sort of embarrassing. All right, so let me get I'm going to kind of do all right, do you want a poem about skinny dipping in high school? Give me yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, that's a no. Do you want no poem at all? We can do that too. Do you want about driving a car off a cliff because there's no other good way to get rid of one? Yeah. Okay. Do you want one about watching? This is like in the 8th grade. Watching Basic Instinct at the movie theater for the first time.
I'm the only one I'm holding up.
Only vaguely. Y'all know what happens in that movie, right? Sharon Stone very slowly uncrosses her legs in a skirt with no underwear in front of the police in order to get okay. It's like one of the most iconic moments in all of film history. Okay, joyriding in my mother's car is a Corolla. It's dope. Okay, I think we have a winner with driving a car off a cliff.
Corolla.
It's worthy. Okay, this is called Driving. I've never read this one out loud. Driving to become. So thank
It's
you.
never won.
It's
never
I've
won.
only done this like two or three times, and it didn't win. The skinny dipping was the winner. You the other 2 times? Okay. This is Driving to the Cumberland for my best friend who was there. They know they aren't the first or the last. Sorry, I forgot. I haven't read in a while. Okay, Driving into the Cumberland. They know they aren't the first or the last, clanging along in their clam bake of 30 weight and red-lined RPMs. Blood brothers weaving in and out of the US 100's metered yellow dashes. They're 16 making their stoned way 15 miles west of town to that sheer drop of Tennessee limestone, where gas pedal weighed down with a cinder block and stick shifted into D. They watch that V6 peel out in a sidewinder of mud clods and black exhaust to somersault 80 feet to the Cheatham County Cumberland River below. These are the days before death and finances will stop them back at the fork in the highway. The days when they still compare the putting on of a condom to suiting up for the moon and are angry at their fathers for being their fathers. When they think back on it, I'm sorry I'm laughing so much, but I haven't read in a while. When they think back on it, they'll think it's all the unknowing of 16 years that drove them to that promontory, the Continental's single headlamp coppering as it sank like a submersible in the waters made murky by runoff, to watch it disappear around a bend in the river and know for fact they've left their mark on the city of their births, to peer into the shallows of the riverfront 8 blocks from their high school and envision that Continental at rest in that mausoleum of Cutlass Sierras and totaled GTOs. What was it about that Continental that just begged to fly? They'll ask all summer, rewriting the details of their story beyond even their own disbelief. Just watch how, electing to stay in the car, they toss back the last dregs of their fifth of tequila, yell "fuck it," and floor that once luxury four-door, speeding for the cliff's edge. What song Billy Corgan shures through the radio will change hands in the telling innumerable times. What degree of fullness the moon they will be wise to misremember. Look at them, swimming by its baleful light back to shore. Look at them lying and laughing together. Tonight they are alive. Tonight they are breathing. Neither is thinking of the long walk home. Neither yet knows that weaving their way back to town through the moonlit dark, that stumbling stoned along the edge of the highway they just drove, Peter will keep saying over and over, look, it's the world. We are finally seeing the world. Thank you for selecting that.
All right. Thank you so much to our writers.